Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. William Davis. I'm going to talk today about something very important. If you're looking at health from the perspective of what I call shape and body composition, in other words, I am inviting you to get rid of this very old fashioned, outdated, and dangerous, yes, dangerous notion of just losing weight. So that's a topic for another day, but know that the conventional methods of losing weight are actually setting up landmines in your future health. It actually accelerates falls, fractures, loss of independence, dementia, and even programs your body for an earlier death. That science is surprisingly quite well worked out. See my other videos, see my many blog posts, williamdavismd.com, my Define Health podcast, and of course my books. And this conversation today, focusing on cortisol and its effects on shape and body composition, is part of the conversation I'm trying to propagate through my Super Body book. That is, the subtitle is a three-week program to harness the new science of body composition and restore youthful contours. And I mean that. We're going to focus on you from the perspective of shape and body composition and not this outdated and dangerous idea of just losing weight. So let's get to it. So we'll talk about how cortisol, this hormone, is a major influence, has a major effect in shaping your body, where fat is located, where muscle is located, how much you have. So let's talk about what is cortisol, how cortisol is a major factor in so-called circadian rhythm, and what is circadian rhythm, how circadian rhythm of your body can be disrupted, how cortisol interferes or worsens and insulin resistance, major factor in shape and body composition, why visceral fat in the abdomen expands when you have disorders or disruptions of cortisol metabolism, why higher cortisol and mistiming of cortisol erodes muscle, which is very important. We do not want to lose muscle. We'll talk about that as we age and experience all the disturbances of life. And then let's talk about specific strategies you can easily adopt to improve your cortisol status. Now, living on this planet, our bodies, you, your neighbors, your friends, your family, everybody around you, more or less adheres to a circadian rhythm that adheres to the Earth's cycles of night and day. And so our bodies have adapted to this via sleep cycles, wake cycles, of course, when we feed, the patterns of hormonal release, the patterns of our nervous system, they all more or less adhere to a rhythm set by the planet, set by the Earth, the so-called circadian rhythm. And in our bodies, there are many things that mediate this circadian rhythm and its effects on your body. But the primary movers, the primary mediators of your circadian rhythm, cortisol and melatonin. There are other factors, but these two we're going to focus on specifically today. And believe it or not, the microbiota in your gastrointestinal tract, even those microbes, the trillions of microbes in your GI tract, also can follow a circadian rhythm. So your entire body is more or less subject to the rhythm of this planet. Now, unfortunately, many of the things that humans have done over the many generations of our survival on this planet, we've disrupted the circadian rhythm in all its aspects. Stress can do it, whether it's social stress, physical stress, emotional stress, trying to follow unnatural schedules, the worst being night shift work or traveling across different time zones, that can do it too. Our tendency nowadays to live indoors without exposure to sunlight, exposure to artificial wavelengths of light, such as excessive blue at night, for instance, and insufficient red earlier in the day. That'll also disrupt your circadian rhythm. And disruption of the gastrointestinal microbiome. If the gastrointestinal microbes participate in the circadian rhythm and we have decimated them by exposure to such things as antibiotics, well, that also contributes to a disruption of our circadian rhythm and thereby effects on shape and body composition. So think of cortisol and melatonin as being kind of the yin and yang of the circadian rhythm. Cortisol is influenced by light, and melatonin is released by your brain in the absence of light, that is dark. And so they're kind of opposites. So we can use this observation to help better manage your body's capacity to follow, to adhere to the circadian rhythm. And we can follow cortisol. Now, many hormones cannot be assessed in saliva because salivary levels don't always accurately reflect blood levels or tissue levels. But cortisol is the exception. Salivary cortisol has proven to be very reliable. It very accurately reflects the blood levels of cortisol. And so we can use the very easy to obtain salivary samples. And the normal circadian rhythm follows what's called a diurnal pattern, kind of a two-phase pattern. You can see, as the graph shows, there's an initial rise that begins in early morning hours, like 3 a.m., peaks at around 6 a.m. This is all, of course, subject to change depending on your habits and how old you are, etc. But on average, we peak at about 6 a.m. There's a sharp drop-off to about noontime or lunchtime, and then a further drop off for cortisol levels in the in saliva in the evening hours. And then there's very low levels once again to allow you to sleep because cortisol is the hormone of arousal. And then the cycle repeats. Big surge in the morning to facilitate arousal, sharp drop off towards lunchtime, further drop off into the evening hours to allow you to sleep. So cortisol is released by the hypothalamus, but also there's participation by the pituitary gland. So we say the hypothalamic pituitary axis is what determines to a great degree your cortisol status. Cortisol is also produced in the adrenal glands, also in the liver, and surprisingly, abdominal fat and subcutaneous fat. So fat in the abdomen and circling your organs, as well as subcutaneous fat below the skin. They all participate to some degree in the production of cortisol adhering to the circadian rhythm. So it's the hypothalamic pituitary axis that is a major player in your cortisol status, and stress plays a very large role in just how much of these hormones are released from the hypothalamus, from the pituitary, from the adrenal gland, and then normally there's a feedback circuit where cortisol turns off further activity from the hypothalamus and pituitary so that you don't get excessive quantities of cortisol in a normal situation. But stress interferes, whether it's emotional stress or some form of social stress or even a physical stress, all provoke increased release of cortisol. Depression is associated with higher levels of cortisol, though it's not clear whether that high cortisol is a cause of depression or whether it's an effect, a consequence of depression. So that's an open question. Sleep disruption will disrupt the patterns of cortisol release. Indoor living without exposure to light, full spectrum of light and sunlight, that can disrupt your cortisol circadian rhythm. And then last, we'll focus more on this, the so-called gut-brain axis. Because we've lost so many beneficial microbes due to our exposure to antibiotics and other factors, and many people have developed small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, we say SIBO, S-I-B-O, a situation in which fecal microbes have colonized the small intestine, and the small intestine is very permeable, and those microbes, when they die, the trillions of microbes that don't belong there, die and release their endotoxin. And that endotoxin enters the bloodstream, so-called endotoxemia, a major disruptor of the circadian rhythm of cortisol. So we're going to have to focus on that later on. That is why and how disruption of the gastrointestinal microbiome plays a major role in disrupting circadian rhythm and messing with your cortisol level and thereby your shape and body composition. Now we know there's a disease called Cushing's syndrome, and it's a syndrome in which, usually driven by tumors in the brain, that drives excessive release of cortisol. So we have a living example. It's kind of like diabetes. What's the effect of continuous, frequent high blood glucose? Well, just look at a type 2 diabetic and you'll find out, right? They develop kidney disease, dementia, coronary disease, carotid disease, stroke, all kinds of problems. So type 2 diabetes is a living example of what happens to people who have lots and lots of high blood glucose. Well, Cushing's syndrome, likewise, is a living example of what happens to people when they have very high cortisol levels because of this usually from a brain tumor. So it weakens the arms and legs and other muscles. It weakens bones. It causes weight gain, particularly in the abdomen. So there's a large gain in abdominal visceral fat and other problems. So we know with confidence that excessive levels of cortisol, inappropriate levels of cortisol, have all kinds of health complications. Well, we're not talking about high levels of cortisol to that degree. We're talking about lesser degrees, but they still have similar types of consequences. We also see it when people are treated with steroids like prednisone or methylprednisolone or other drugs like that, and many of the same features that you see in Cushing's syndrome, if taken long enough, like more than a few weeks, you develop all these features also. And among the changes are massive distortions of shape and body composition, loss of muscle, expansion of fat. But why should you? You don't have cortisol, you don't have Cushing's syndrome, right? Why should you have to be concerned about your cortisol status? Well, it's an important thing to manage, especially if you've been through some kind of stress, illness, or have done such things as lived a sedentary life, or are struggling with weight gain, especially in the abdomen, or you're struggling with loss of muscle. So managing your cortisol can help protect you from losing excessive quantities of muscle beyond the 30% or so you lose just by aging. We reduce our risk for falls and fractures, which can plague your later years and can lead to earlier death. It's going to protect you from frailty and loss of independence. Managing your cortisol protects you from accumulating fat in your abdomen. That's the most problematic form of fat that drives blood glucose, blood pressure, risk for dementia, risk for breast cancer, risk for coronary disease, heart disease. So managing cortisol gives you further protection in those areas as well. It's a big player in maintaining cognitive health and protection from dementia. So understanding and managing your cortisol gives you great advantage in multiple aspects of health. What exactly is cortisol? What's the hormone? It's meant to be the circadian rhythm of wakefulness and a way to manage stress. So if you were presented with an acute physical stress, let's say an angry dog or witnessing some violence or a fire, cortisol surges appropriately because it helps you deal with that stress and get away from it. The problem comes when stress becomes chronic, as might happen, say, with difficulties at home, money problems, family problems, financial struggles, critical situation at work, all these chronic sources of stress. That's where it can lead to chronic dysfunction of cortisol, sufficient to not just impact on such things as sleep and mood, but also on shape and body composition. So it doesn't quite reach the proportion of severity of someone with Cushing's disease. You can still experience all the same phenomena: higher blood glucose, expansion of abdominal fat, accelerated loss of muscle, and acceleration of your future towards frailty and loss of independence. So we don't want to let cortisol get out of hand. But among the most important effects that increase cortisol, the expansion of abdominal visceral fat, having too much fat in the abdomen, and that endotoxemia from a disrupted gastrointestinal microbiome. So of all the things that can disrupt your cortisol, those two are the biggest factors. Stress is a big factor also, but you know what? It's really tough. I can sit here and say to you, please get rid of the stress. Well, good luck with that, right? It's not always possible. If you have an older parent, for instance, who needs your help because they have dementia, you have a child with autism, you have a job you're relying on for income to pay your mortgage, all the sources of stress. Sometimes it's not always easy or possible to escape that source of stress. So let's focus on, of course, deal with those stresses, but let's focus today on aspects of cortisol metabolism that you do have some control over, but specifically the quantity of abdominal visceral fat you have and whether or not you have endotoxemia. So you now know cortisol is a major player in determining your circadian rhythm. It determines the quality and the duration of your sleep, and it's also subject to how much time you spend outdoors and to what wavelengths of light you're exposed to. And so all these things add up to distortions of cortisol. You can have excessively high levels of cortisol, you can have excessively low levels of cortisol, and you can have disorders of timing of cortisol, because as you see in this normal salivary curve, that there's an expected pattern to your release of cortisol from your brain, from the adrenal glands. What if you're acutely stressed? Something very stressful happens where there's a sudden excessive surge in cortisol, but that's appropriate because that also helps you escape from whatever threat you're perceiving. So that's normal. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it just happens that we have access to salivary cortisols, which is, unlike some other hormones, very accurate in reflecting blood levels of cortisol and tissue levels. So you can use that simple maneuver of looking at salivary cortisol to approximate what cortisol is doing in the rest of your body. And we typically, when you do these tests, there's typically 4, sometimes more, samples. One upon immediately arising, so typically 6 or 7 a.m., then one around lunchtime, and then 2, one towards dinner time, one towards bedtime. That's the most common way to do it. There are other variations on this in case there's a specific question. For instance, if you are struggling to stay asleep at 3 a.m., 3 a.m. would be a really good time to get that salivary cortisol. But in general, we get 4 samples to get an idea of what the cortisol curve looks like, the cortisol curve of release looks like. Here's a common pattern in someone who complains of fatigue and low energy. You can see that the morning level is unusually low, and then all subsequent levels, lunchtime, dinner time, bedtime, are all kind of lowish also. This is typically the pattern you see someone who says, I wake up in the morning and I don't feel rested. I'm still tired. And all day long, I'm struggling. I'm drinking more coffee. I'm trying to wake myself up. I just have no energy. It's also associated with low grip strength. And those who follow my conversations know that grip strength is a major indicator of your overall health. There's a separate talk about that, by the way. Chronic stress, so long-standing stress, let's say taking care of an elderly parent friend, that can do this. Living your lifestyle to excessive degrees indoors without being outside and exposure to air and reflected light and trees and microbes. All those things can also lead to this unusually low level of cortisol. In situations where you've experienced PTSD or had something terrible happen to you as a child, or chronic depression, these are situations that can also be associated with very low salivary cortisol. And we now know that people who have this pattern are more likely to die of cancer. They have an impaired immune response and thereby more subject to various infections. They're more inflamed, and they tend to be generally in poorer health. So it is worth knowing about. It is worth taking steps to correct if you have this pattern of around-the-clock low cortisol. And this is a situation where you may even have to take something to boost cortisol, such as hydrocortisone. Here's another common pattern where there's an excessively high level of cortisol and excessively low levels later in the day. So that can be lots of morning energy, but then a sharp drop off in energy in the afternoon and into night. This is also another pattern that can happen with chronic, unrelenting stress. Here's another pattern, another variation, where the morning level is just fine, the lunchtime level is pretty good, but there seems to be higher levels towards the evening. This is typical in people who have a hard time either falling asleep or staying asleep. And this has implications. This has consequences. It can lead to loss of muscle. So remember those people with Cushing's disease? One of the things they have are skinny arms and legs because they lost huge amounts of muscle. Or a similar phenomenon can occur here. When you have excessive levels of cortisol, you lose muscle. And that sets the stage long-term for frailty, loss of independence, even dementia. So we don't want this pattern to persist. And you can see it experienced as people just can't walk really fast, or they have problems with balance, or they're depressed. And of course, all too often, obesity is part of the driver in this. Though this pattern, sometimes it's not entirely clear whether the high cortisol is a cause of these problems or an effect of these problems, or probably some combination of both. Now, here's the effect of endotoxemia. So remember, endotoxemia is the situation that develops when you've had fecal microbes that were supposed to stay in the colon ascend into the 24 feet of small intestine where they don't belong. The small intestine is not well equipped to deal with trillions of fecal microbes. It doesn't have the same kind of protections that the colon has, for instance, and the small intestine is meant to be permeable because that's where we absorb nutrients like vitamins, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids. And so the small intestine is by design very permeable. But when those fecal microbes enter the small intestine, colonize it, and then live and die, these microbes only live for a few hours. They release their endotoxins from their cell walls. That endotoxin gains access into the bloodstream. Now, here's a set of experiments in which endotoxin was directly injected intravenously into normal people. And what it did was it caused an inappropriate surge in cortisol, suggesting that people who have this situation, SIBO, with the entry or the colonization of the small intestine with fecal microbe, this is exceptionally common, by the way, it drives higher levels of cortisol, thereby contributing to all those problems like expansion of abdominal fat, erosion or loss of muscle, higher blood glucose, damage to the brain that mimics Alzheimer's disease, and all kinds of other problems. So that endotoxin is a very potent. Now, the studies suggest that the longer the endotoxemia goes on, it's not quite as bad. It's worse in its early days, but it still remains bad, even chronically, even at higher levels of endotoxin. So any level of endotoxemia is not good for us. Now, what we don't know, this research has not yet been done. If you have SIBO and thereby endotoxemia, what can we expect in the pattern of a 4-sample salivary cortisol? It's not been explored yet. I suspect it's higher level. It tends to generate higher levels in the early months and years, and perhaps lower levels when there's so-called fatigue or burnout of the adrenal glands producing cortisol, and then you get fatigue. But that research has not been done. No one's tracked this over time to see the evolution of changes. But just know that if there's a disruption of your salivary cortisol pattern, one of the things you want to think about is, do you have SIBO and thereby endotoxemia? Because that's something you can do a lot about, and addressing it effectively can lead to all sorts, a long list of huge health advantages, among which is improvement in your cortisol status, reduction of abdominal visceral fat, and maintenance or even restoration of youthful musculature. So that's where it comes back into the conversation relevant to so-called shape and body composition. Let's talk for a moment about the importance of muscle, something just not thought about too often, right? People lose weight, and when they lose weight, there's an obligatory, in most situations, an obligatory loss of muscle, significant loss of muscle. So just by aging, about a third of your muscle that you had in your 20s and 30s is lost by age 70 or so. So there's a large loss of muscle. That amplifies insulin resistance and inflammation. Those are situations that add to disease risk, like diabetes and heart disease and dementia. There's the loss of muscle allows more easy expansion of abdominal visceral fat. And you lose muscle, and there's a double whammy here because that abdominal visceral fat is often accompanied by a situation called myosteatosis. And all that means is the more abdominal fat you have, uh, because maybe you had a high cortisol level, an inappropriate high cortisol level, you start to deposit fat in muscle, and it further impairs muscle. That's called myosteatosis. So increased abdominal fat from cortisol disruption or excessive cortisol, one of the effects is myosteatosis. And loss of factors, we'll talk about this. Many of us have lost factors that help maintain muscle, such as the microbe Lactobacillus rhodori or Lactobacillus gasseri, the hormone oxytocin, the failure to get food components like collagen or hyaluronic acid because we've been told to cut our saturated fat. Most people abandon the consumption of organ meats and thereby lead a diet depleted or lacking collagen and hyaluronic acid, two things that play major roles in where fat is located, where muscle is located, how much muscle you have. And of course, high cortisol leads to loss of muscle, just as it does in those people with Cushing's disease, but even those of us who don't have Cushing's disease but have lesser levels of cortisol disruption. So we live in a world in which many factors lead to an accelerated loss of muscle. And this has very serious long-term health implications. So here's what it looks like on a CAT scan or MRI in cross-section of the thigh. You can see on the left is a young man, on the right is a much older man, and you can see there's dramatic loss of muscle and there's an increase in fat, the white. So that's what happens with aging. You can also see that you can't see in this the way this is color-coded, but there's also fat into the muscle, so-called myosteatosis. So when you have an increase in abdominal fat from many factors, including a higher or inappropriate surge in cortisol, insulin resistance and inflammation are worse. That has their own set of complications like further loss of muscle, increased abdominal visceral fat. Cortisol goes higher when you have abdominal visceral fat. That erodes muscle. Testosterone can decline in males, increased myosteatosis, as I mentioned, and of course, this is all compounding the effects that develop with aging. This is what myosteatosis looks like in somebody with, in this case, coronary disease. So coronary disease or heart attacks occur almost exclusively in people who have too much abdominal visceral fat and often have high cortisol levels. And because of these two things, you get so-called myosteatosis. You can see the arrow pointing to the red, that's muscle. The green within the red is myosteatosis fat. And myosteatosis, as shown in the right graphs, becomes very, very common the older we get. It can occur in younger people, and I think this study is an underestimation of myosteatosis. But the older you get, the more likely it is, and especially in women, it becomes the rule into your 70s and 80s that you will have myosteatosis. And we know if you have myosteatosis, you're likely to die several years younger. And your last few years are more likely to be plagued by fatigue, loss of independence, falls, fractures, frailty, dementia. So this is a serious matter. And one of the things that leads you down this path is a disruption of your cortisol status. Let's now talk about this gut-brain axis and how it affects cortisol and muscle. So here's one of the early experiments in mice where oxytocin, the hormone oxytocin, people think of oxytocin as a hormone of love and empathy, and it is that. It's also the hormone of uterine contraction. And that's why a pregnant woman who wishes to deliver a child at a specific time can go to the hospital, she has an IV implanted, and then she's given an infusion of oxytocin, often called Pitocin. And that causes uterine contraction, and the child is delivered. But it's become clear in the last decade that oxytocin is far more. It's also the hormone of affection, generosity, of the acceptance of other people's opinions, and of body shape and composition, body composition. And so when Lactobacillus rhodori, which is responsible for controlling the gut-brain axis that thereby leads to the release of oxytocin, leads to a huge surge in blood levels of oxytocin. And even better, restoration of Lactobacillus rhodori also leads to a dramatic reduction in cortisol. It's labeled corticosterone here because this is a mouse. They're equivalent of cortisol. Cortisol is the human form. Corticosterone is the mouse form. You can see there's a dramatic cutting in half of the corticosterone level. So Lactobacillus rhodori, this gastrointestinal microbe, lost by nearly all modern people, because it's very susceptible to common antibiotics. So if you took, for instance, clarithromycin or azithromycin or doxycycline or some other common antibiotic 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you likely lost all the Lactobacillus rhodori and thereby your capacity for provoking oxytocin, a major influence over body composition, and you have persistent high levels of cortisol. So restoring Lactobacillus rhodori is a major advantage in regaining control over cortisol, shape, and body composition. Here's a human study where Lactobacillus rhodori was supplemented, in this case, with another microbe, Bifidobacteria brevi, a relatively small dose, 2 billion microbes per day over 4 weeks. And there was, once again, similar to the mice, not quite as big, but still about a third reduction in salivary cortisol. Suggests it's probably the rhodori, by the way. We don't really know how much Bifidobacterium brevi does, but at least the rhodori we know reduces salivary cortisol dramatically. So restoration of this lost microbe, rhodori, and perhaps this other microbe, can play a big role in giving you back control if you have inappropriately high levels of cortisol. It still has benefits even if you don't have cortisol, and it won't reduce cortisol if it doesn't start high. In other words, think of it not as so much reducing cortisol as normalizing cortisol. How about Lactobacillus gasseri, another really interesting microbe? In this case, 10 billion counts per day for 4 weeks. And people who got the gasseri likewise, not quite as potent as the rhodori, but still had a modest reduction in cortisol. So if you have a situation where you have high cortisol, excessive abdominal fat, loss of muscle, and all the other things associated with disruption of cortisol, sleep disruption, for instance, high blood glucose, Lactobacillus rhodori, Lactobacillus gasseri, major players in giving you back control via the gut-brain axis and other factors over cortisol. So when should you consider one of those 4-sample salivary cortisol tests? Well, if you've tried to lose weight and it doesn't work, you've done all the right things. By the way, you never want to lose weight by cutting calories. That's another conversation because that shortens your life and has all kinds of consequences that are bad. So we do it by cutting out wheat, grains, and sugars and improving insulin resistance. That's a whole other conversation. See my other programs, my YouTube videos, my Define Health podcast, my thousands of WilliamDavisMD.com blog posts, and of course my two-way Zoom conversations on my membership website, the innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com. We're talking about these kinds of things and safe ways to lose weight that do not abbreviate your life. But you want to consider cortisol, assessing your cortisol through a 4-sample salivary test. If you're failing at weight loss, despite doing everything right, if you can't seem to shake off that abdominal fat, if you have residual problems, you're doing everything right? You're doing the diet, the no wheat, no grains, no sugars. You've supplemented nutrients that affect insulin resistance and inflammation, like vitamin D, magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, iodine, and you still have a high blood glucose, high blood insulin, high triglycerides, or small LDL particles. Those are all consequences of disrupted metabolism, excessive abdominal fat. If you have low muscle mass, because you had a bioimpedance smart scale, you had a DEXA and it showed low muscle mass, or if you have low muscle strength, see my video on how to use a dynamometer to measure grip strength. Not that grip strength per se is important, but grip strength is a proxy or an indirect reflection of overall health, including overall muscular strength. So it's not just grip strength that's important. Grip strength just happens to be a very easy, inexpensive way to assess body musculature status. So if any of these factors apply to you, think about having a 4-sample cortisol test to see if cortisol disruption is part of the reason why these things are happening to you. There are a number of platforms that you can use. Don't need a doctor's order to do these kinds of things. You can do it on your own, and then you'll know by submitting those 4 samples. It's very easy to do. I think it's about $200 typically. So it's not the cheapest, but it's not terrible either. And you can do this, of course, without having to pay a doctor's copay or other fees. It's just the test alone. So what can you do? What's in the list of things that you can do on your own that gives you better control over cortisol, especially if it's high? If it's low, that's really tough. And that's a situation that probably has to be managed by somebody in functional medicine who can actually write you a prescription for hydrocortisone, because there's no easy way to increase cortisol production. So these are things that mostly either decrease abnormal or inappropriate rises in cortisol, or help shift timing. If you, for instance, had that inappropriate surge in early morning hours that keeps you from sleeping. Being exposed habitually to bright morning light, especially rich in both blue and red wavelengths. Now, if you just go outside in the sun, that has the full spectrum. Sun is the best way to do it. But what if you live in a latitude like I live, where it's either dark and cloudy or too cold to be outside much of the year? That's where you can get lights. You can manage lights. You can get bright white light and add a red, infrared, visible red, infrared to your morning. And then also minimizing your exposure to blue. Blue comes by way of your computer screens, your tablets, your phones. So you don't have to avoid altogether, but reduce your exposure to blue because it tends to shut off your release of melatonin. So, but morning light, very important. Combination of blue and red. Think about supplementing evening melatonin if you're really struggling to kind of force your body to readopt a normal circadian cycle. That is evening melatonin that allows a morning surge in cortisol. You want to work on minimizing abdominal visceral fat. That's a whole conversation of its own, but know that the programs I advocate, that is a diet absent all wheat, grains, and sugars, common nutrient supplements that synergize to minimize insulin resistance. This all facilitates loss of abdominal visceral fat, as does, by the way, light management, as mentioned just a moment ago. We're going to minimize insulin resistance using the same kinds of strategies. We're going to address SIBO and endotoxemia. That also is a whole conversation of its own, but know that what we've been doing is restoring microbes like Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus gasseri, and that can help get rid of SIBO. It's part of the program we use to get rid of SIBO, to reduce the colonization of the small intestine with fecal microbes that were producing endotoxin. We're going to push those microbes back by recolonizing with microbes like reuteri and gasseri, which are known and unusual because they actually colonize the small intestine and not just the colon. That's unusual for beneficial microbes. And those two species, reuteri and gasseri, are also known vigorous producers of what are called bacteriocins, natural antibiotics effective in killing invading fecal microbes. So if this interests you, see my conversations and my recipe for something I call SIBO yogurt. It's not yogurt. It looks and smells like yogurt, but it's not yogurt. And it's actually 3 microbes, Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus gasseri, and the most recent one I added, Bacillus subtilis, because all 3 colonize the small intestine, produce bacteriocins, and this has been unexpectedly successful in normalizing SIBO as judged by testing for hydrogen gas in the breath. Whole nother conversation. Think about getting the microbe, the fungus, Saccharomyces boulardii. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the fungus used to make wine and beer. We use its cousin, Saccharomyces boulardii, to ferment juices. It makes a very wonderful effervescent or carbonated juice by fermenting at room temperature of about 72 hours. And drinking a quarter to half cup a couple times a day is a huge advantage. Even though Saccharomyces itself does not take up residence, it somehow cultivates the return of beneficial species. These are species like Faecalibacterium, Akkermansia, and Eubacteria. These are beneficial microbes that help you reduce cortisol, reduce abdominal visceral fat, and other health benefits. Now, in the uncommon situation where you have very low cortisol levels all throughout the day or in the morning, that's a situation that you do need the assistance of someone to write the prescription for hydrocortisone. But in the majority of cases, you have the means to take back control over cortisol its pattern of release. It may take time. I'll tell you, trying to regulate your cortisol, reducing inappropriate high levels, and or shifting the timing is among the hardest things to do. It won't happen overnight. It typically takes months, even years of consistent effort, of getting that morning light, of getting evening melatonin, of working to mineralize abdominal fat, restoring those microbes. It won't happen right away. It's going to take time, but it's definitely worth it, because when you do this and you succeed at it, you slow down or stop the loss of muscle. You reduce your likelihood of experiencing falls and fractures and thereby frailty in your future. You reduce abdominal fat. You reduce the likelihood of cognitive impairment and dementia. And you maximize the likelihood you'll live a life independent, not reliant on some facility or caretakers. This gives you better control over health by managing cortisol, managing your gastrointestinal microbiome, managing your diet. Now, if this kind of conversation interests you, I expand the conversation in my newest book, Super Body, a 3-week program to harness the new science of body composition and restore your youthful contours, where I give you a lot of these recipes, how to do this, how to take better control over shape, body composition, a far superior approach to the now outdated and dangerous ways to lose weight by cutting calories.